we're going to look at this strange reaction of the Hebrews versus the Egyptians when they're eating together. So this actually leads us into our theological rabbit trail. All right, guys. So this week we're asking this question of why did the Egyptians view eating with the Hebrews as detestable? That's what we just read in this last chapter.
They seem to have a strange aversion to sheep herding peoples for some odd reason.
They did. We see that discussion later with Pharaoh, Jacob, and Joseph. Joseph's trying to explain to his father Jacob, hey, the Hebrews, they don't like shepherds. So just tell them that, tell Pharaoh, introduce yourself the way I tell you to introduce yourself. We're going to read about that in a little bit.
You said it backwards. The Egyptians don't like shepherds.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. The Egyptians didn't like the shepherds. So this is the part right here in Genesis 43:32. They ate separately because the Egyptians would not eat it with the Hebrews since that was detestable. Okay. So they had this strange prejudice towards the Hebrews. Now, what I found that was interesting is that this is the same type of prejudice that we see in the other nations that are not serving Yahweh and in the hearts of people that are going against the laws of Yahweh or the behavior that Yahweh tells his disciples to do.
Such as the Pharisees in first century Judea.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's where, so we got in Genesis 46, which you're going to read about next week. He tells us a little bit about this, like what I just mentioned, right? Joseph is trying to explain the introduction of his brothers and his father after they came down to the land of Goshen to Pharaoh. And here at the bottom in verse 34, he says, you are to say your servants have raised livestock ever since our youth, both we and our fathers. Then you'll be allowed to settle the land of Goshen, since all the shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. So there's this strange inherent bias that had been developing. We're going to see it intensify after the brothers moved down for a couple hundred years. That intensifies and eventually leads to the oppression of the Hebrews by the Egyptians once the king of Canaan takes over Egypt. And this, what leads us to Exodus chapter 8, is this moment when this king of Canaan has taken over Egypt as the Pharaoh. And so this is the king of Canaan who also was from Assyria because he was ruling over Babylon. So a lot of people don't realize that Babylon was ruling Egypt when the Israelites went into severe oppression, were restricted from worshiping Yahweh in the land of Goshen. And the people of Egypt were taught and fomented to hate the Hebrews even more than this inherent bias that they already had originally just because of their occupation. So this intensified. The more that unrighteousness ruled in the land, the more prejudice and hatred intensified for the people of Yahweh. And
what have you heard about why the shepherd occupation? What is it they...
Well, yeah, I personally, like, if I just think about it, I honestly don't find it that hard to believe. And I think we kind of do the same thing. If you think about the Egyptians, like a lot of the stuff, we know they wore makeup and they were very kind of progressive as far as like their standards. They had high medicine and they were really clean. A shepherd's going to stink and they're going to be dirty and they're going to be probably not the most handsome thing to look at. And I see all the time, like, you don't see, if a homeless person wanted to come in and have a meal, clean, put together people would be like, whoa, what are you doing, pal? And they'd kind of separate. And so I don't know if it's as much just a bias towards the shepherds as it was like, that's a dirty, unclean person. Like, get away from them. They stink. I don't want to be around that nonsense. And so I think it's really not that different today.
The Hebrews didn't have the same maybe materialistic, like upkeep of, I don't know. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah. I mean, I think of a shepherd, their clothes are going to be worn out. They're going to be sleeping with the sheep. They probably don't smell that good. They're, I'm sure they still have hygiene standards and stuff, but if you're around sheep all the time, you're not going to be as presentable and clean as, somebody who's counting money all day long, for example.
Sure. You may just have an inherent smell on you. There's a sheep farm that we used to drive by when we used to live in northern Colorado that, boy, you could smell it literally from like 15 miles away. And then when you drove by it, it was just the smell, the stench was strong. And so the neighboring town, whenever there was an east wind, the neighboring town would smell like the sheep farm. And so even though the sheep farm was way out 10 miles out to the east of it. So it's just funny how, they do have a strong smell for sure. But we do know that the Hebrews had a sense of understanding what it means to cleanse themselves and be ready to go to the temple to offer sacrifice, whomever was ministering at Bethel at that time. And so, but yeah, I agree with you as far as just a general premise. There could be definitely an inherent cultural bias just because of occupation, just if they smelled a lot. We see this, I think, kind of reflected in James chapter 2, where James is trying to encourage people not to show favoritism if someone comes into you that's of low economic value, and then another wealthy person comes in, don't show the wealthy person favoritism. And I think it's interesting, though, that as this hatred intensified, it intensified because of the Babylonian ruler that came in over Egypt and took over Pharaoh. This is detailed in, I think, Jubilees chapter 48 or 47. As there was a war between Egypt and the king from Assyria, who was actually from the land of Canaan. So I think this is interesting that once that transition of power happened, here as we see in Exodus chapter 8, this conversation between Pharaoh, Moses, and Aaron, says Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, go sacrifice to your God within this land. So this is after multiple interactions between Moses and Aaron presenting themselves to Pharaoh and saying, this is what we'd like to do. And with each interaction, Pharaoh changes the parameters, he changes the rules. And in this one is no different, this particular moment where he tells Moses, go and sacrifice to your God within this land. Moses replied, it would not be right to do that, because the sacrifices we offer to the Lord our God will be detestable to the Egyptians. If we offer sacrifices that are detestable for the Egyptians, will they not stone us? So he kept saying, we need to leave this land 3 days journey into the wilderness to go do our sacrifices with all of our people and with all of our animals. And Pharaoh just keeps saying, like, back and forth, no, just take your people, don't take your animals. Okay, no, leave your kids here. Just take the adults. And he's like, no, okay. So now here's another moment where he's trying to change the rules. And he's like, all right, well, all of you guys can sacrifice in the land with all your animals, do whatever you want, just do it in the land. You can't leave. All right. So that wasn't what Moses and Aaron are asking for. There's this idea of the Egyptians viewing the Hebrews as detestable. And I think this is fascinating because we see this type of thing all throughout the scripture, right? Is that the people that were doing the ways of the nations and not respecting Yahweh inherently had this strange feeling of prejudice towards people that wanted to do the ways of Yahweh, as well as the poor and the people in society that didn't have that were of less regard, if I should put it like this. They were low esteem, they had issues financially in their life, and they were considered poor. We see Jesus having addressed this same type of attitude within the Pharisees, and there's a lot of people that would like to present the case that the Pharisees came over from Babylon in the 2nd and 3rd century BC. And this is where this Talmudic teaching started really codifying into what was a pure form of Judaism that then gets corrupted into this Talmudic oral tradition of Judaism, bringing over all these traditions from Babylonian influence. And here we have Jesus addressing this same type of attitude of the Pharisees, holding themselves in the sense of elitism over other people in the society that they viewed it to, for whatever reason, their occupation to be of less regard. So here in Matthew 9:13 says, Jesus went on from there. He saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax booth. He said, follow me. He told him. Matthew got up and followed him. So later, as Jesus was dining at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said, is it not the wealthy who need a doctor? It's not the wealthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. So the reason I say that is this idea of viewing another person in your society as detestable is a huge heart issue. Because Joseph is treating all the Egyptians in his realm with respect, and he doesn't view them as detestable. But yet when these other foreigners come in, the Egyptians kind of show their backside, right? They show that they got this strange attitude of viewing these other people, and specifically shepherds, as detestable. So this is, to me, I'm seeing like the same heart as the Pharisees from within this cultural institution of prejudice that's being propagated throughout Egypt, even all the way back during the days with Joseph. So here in Galatians 2, it says, when Cephas came to Antioch, however, I opposed him to his face because he stood to be condemned. or before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself for fear of those in the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. And when I saw that they were not walking in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, if you who are a Jew live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? Now, unfortunately, the dispensational crowd will say, see, we're not supposed to do the law of God. Excuse you. Well, guys, the Jews had their own codes and customs, many of which based on old tradition. And that's why we read from Matthew 9 just a few moments ago of Yeshua addressing their particular traditions that caused them to override the law of God, caused them to ignore the law of God, which was like WesBlaze mentioned, to treat the foreigner with love and respect, and also to treat everybody in your society with love and respect. And so this was a moment where Peter, being swayed by this intimidating group of this quote unquote circumcision group, which was a group of Pharisees of that sect, that even Peter and Barnabas were going back to this tradition in their time, which was to not eat with people from other nations.
Meanwhile, they're going around saying love, preaching the gospel of Yeshua, which is, part of it. Part of it is to love one another. He said the greatest commandments: love the Lord your God and love one another, right? And then they're like, except those guys, don't love them.
Yeah. Can you imagine, like, and this is, oh man, I remember when I was in a youth group when I was younger, and the youth pastor was trying to talk to us about cliques, and he was like, look, he's like, I can't stop you if you're at high school, if you're at another building, but he says, when you're in this church and you're in this youth group, you're not going to be in cliques. I want all of you to interact. I want all of you to do the games and the activities and everything. I don't want you guys just pairing off in the little groups and having cliques, because I didn't understand that back then, because I was like, oh, this is just what kids do. Like, that because at churches, there were multiple different school districts that the kids from those different school districts, different parts of town might go to one centralized church. So you didn't really know all these kids that went all to the youth group, but that's what this youth pastor was trying to help us learn, right? To overcome this inherent seclusionary bias of, I don't know that person, therefore I'm going to treat them differently. You know what I mean? But instead be openly and loving towards everyone that you're around. And this is that same type of internal fearful bias that Cephas and Peter and Barnabas are slipping into out of fear of those in the circumcision group. So this is an intimidation factor about this, that they're not standing up for what's right either. And Paul is like, look, man, I had to address them about this, because they were, trying to fall back into these traditions that were being taught by the Pharisees, even though our master Yeshua had told us to go to the nations and tell them the good news. Right. Which means inherently that if they accept the good news, they're grafted in and they're part of us now.
Yeah.
And then we have the Torah, right? Which the Torah tells you, Exodus 12, Numbers 35, and other places, even if they're not grafted in yet, treat them with love. The foreigner within your gates, right? There's one law for everybody. Well, what's that law? That law equals your loving behavior towards them. Mm-hmm. So it's like the whole concept was there should be no prejudicial seclusionary mentality. You need to treat everybody the same with love and respect. Treat them as if they're already family. And so I thought it's fascinating here, because this is what Peter has to learn in this extravagant way with this vision about these animals in Acts chapter 9 through 14. And then he learns that lesson, and then he explains what he learned when he meets Cornelius, whom he's told by the Spirit of God that he's supposed to go meet Cornelius with this kind of like this divine appointment kind of thing. And Cornelius, an angel of God, shows up to him and tells him to go meet Peter. So but Cornelius is an Italian, right? So he's quote unquote of the nations, but he's a devout person that devoutly fears God, which I think is fascinating. He's already trying to learn, and he's already respecting God, and he fears God. But from my understanding, he just didn't know about Jesus yet. So Peter's about to explain the rest of it to him, right?
Real quick, I wondered, when it says that he feared God, did that mean that he had the Torah and he feared God that way, or he knew that just based on like looking at creation that, man, there has to be something that made this? Do we get any insight into that?
I personally believe he did have access to some of the scrolls, and it already had a conversion moment, if you will, because remember, Yeshua talked about in Matthew 23 that the Pharisees, they also traveled on land and sea to go make proselytes. Okay. So but if that's not how he heard about it, you also have the history of the Maccabees from only 150 years earlier, which they then had an incredibly vibrant, faithful society in Samaria and in the Jerusalem area of Israelites doing covenant properly, stuff that, without having the Maccabees in your Bible, you would never have known, right? How did John the Baptist's parents be considered so devout? Who taught them?
Yep.
Right. Where did they learn this behavior? How did, this kind of concept of when you run in, what about this prophetess in Luke chapter 2, Anna from the tribe of Asher? Where did she come from? Who taught her to respect and love Yahweh? Right. So like you already had how do I put this? Like a heartbeat, a swelling of people that were wanting to know God and live right according to his law and his ways, that had seeped out, if I could put it like that, into the Mediterranean area in sprinkled out pieces. And of course, many of the dispersed Israelites were living amongst the Greeks, right? As the disciples theorize in John chapter 14, when Jesus is like, I'm where I'm going, where I'm going. And they're like, wait, where is he going? Is he going to the Greeks? So like, or is he going to those dispersed amongst the Greeks? So like there already was people that understood the ways of Yahweh, the covenant of Yahweh, but they just weren't living in the centralized area of Jerusalem. But in this moment here, Peter is being taught, hey, what you've been taught your whole life from these Pharisees in this region is not Torah. You do not need to regard people from other nations as unclean. You do not need to regard them as like, if God has made them clean, especially if they're a part of the faith, right? If he's grafted them in, they're clean.
Yeah. He explains it again in verse 34 through 35 of the same chapter, right? Opening his mouth, Peter said, I most certainly understand now that God is not one to show partiality, but in every nation, the man who fears him and does what is right is welcome to him.
That's right. That's right. So I'll just read through this real quick for the sake of the audience. We've been kind of commenting on it, but not actually reading it. So Acts chapter 10, this is where it says the next day about the 6th hour. This is verse 9. As the men were approaching the city on their journey, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat, but while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. What I think is interesting about this, guys, just a quick side note, this word trance, it's also used in the book of Jubilees in chapter 14 about Abraham, and which is the altar sacrifice moment of Genesis 15. And it just means you're having a prophetic vision. But we don't use this word anymore, right? This word trance has an extremely horrible connotation to us now, right? Like you're being hypnotized or like you're doing some occultic practice of some sort. But the ancient use of this word trance was like a prophetic vision. So it's interesting that Acts uses it. So it says that he saw heaven open and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of four-footed animals and reptiles of the earth, as well as the birds of the air. Then a voice said to him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "No, Lord," Peter answered, "I've never eaten anything impure or unclean." So the voice spoke to him a second time and said, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." This happened 3 times, and all at once the sheet was taken back into heaven. So unfortunately, a lot of people in the dispensation crowd will say, well, see, look, God was saying that all foods are clean right here. No, that's not what the vision was about. He explains what the vision was about. It was about men being made clean by God through their conversion. So he's going to actually explain that as we keep going. Verse 17, while Peter was puzzling over the meaning of the vision, the men sent by Cornelius found Simon's house and approached the gate. They called out to ask if Simon called Peter was staying there. And as Peter continued to reflect on the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Behold, 3 men are looking for you. So get up, go downstairs and accompany them without hesitation, because I've sent them." So Peter went down to the men and said, "Here I am, the one you're looking for. Why have you come?" "Cornelius the centurion has sent us," they said. "He's a righteous and God-fearing man with a good reputation among the whole Jewish nation. A holy angel instructed him to request your presence in his home so he could hear a message from you." So guys, this guy is so devout, angels are appearing to him. Like, this is just like before Jesus showed up. Devout men got angelic visitations. Yeah. Right? So again, this is just another incredible refutation to this ridiculous dispensation doctrine that everything changed as soon as Jesus showed up. Is that suddenly that God, all the ways that Yahweh works suddenly changed when Jesus No. People that are devout and fear God, God has a consistent behavior with them because it's the consistent behavior he instructs of them in discipleship. Jesus did that behavior. Jesus taught that behavior. Jesus is still doing that behavior. Jesus is going to come back and have the entire world do that behavior. There is consistency with the Father and his Son.
That's right. Yeah, there's still unclean birds in Revelation, right? Paul quotes Leviticus in 2 Corinthians 6 when he says, do not touch what is unclean. Uncleanness is listed as one of the in Galatians 5. What is it? The gifts of the Spirit versus not the fruits of the Spirit, but the bad stuff. Uncleanness is listed as one of those.
Yes. Yeah. So it's a good point. That's a good point, brother. And then Peter invites the guest in the next day, he got ready and went with them and accompanied by some of the brothers from Joppa. The following day, he arrives in Caesarea, where Cornelius was expecting them, and called together his relatives and close friends. And as Peter was about to enter, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet to worship him. But Peter helped him up. Stand up, he said. I'm only a man myself. And as Peter talked with him, he went inside and found many people gathered together. I'm guessing these are people that Cornelius knows. So these may not be, regular groups of disciples that they had been making, and it may not even be Israelites. I'm not sure. Because Caesarea was near the base of Mount Hermon, near the northern border of Israel. So yes, it technically is in the land of Israel, but that's also in northern Samaria. There was a lot of different tribes mixed in with these people groups. Verse 28, Peter says to them, you know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with a foreigner or to visit him. Now, guys, if you don't know the law of God, you don't realize that he's not talking about the law of God. Mm-hmm. He's talking about the law of the Pharisees, the Talmudic oral standard the Pharisees pushed, the fear of the party of the circumcision group.
Traditions of men.
The traditions of men. This is not from the Torah. This is not from the law and the prophets. This is the word law, the nomo in the Greek just means the instruction, right? So the instruction from the Jews of his day that were the circumcision group that imposed this instruction onto the members of Israel, tried to tell people, well, you can't associate with foreigners or visit them. This is why they were giving Jesus a hard time for going to eat with Matthew and the other sinners and tax collectors. It's that same mentality. This was their mentality that they pushed. But Peter explains that God has shown me not to call any man impure or unclean. Then Peter began to speak. I now truly understand that God does not show favoritism. Why would he? We're all descendants of Noah. We're all the same people. Like, why would he possibly? How could he? This is not a science fiction reality. There's not different races, not Star Wars. There's not, this isn't the cafe with like 15 different species of aliens in it. Like, we're all humanity. We're all descendants of Noah. Like, we're all the same people. God can't show favoritism.
Every man will be judged according to their works and deeds.
That's right. So this is where Peter just tries to, he's revealing to them, like, and even some of these people he's never met before, what a strange first time to meet Peter, where he's like, guys, I've realized now that the only reason I'm here is because I told that I can't show favoritism. So it's like such a strange way to introduce yourself. This, they've all heard about Peter, and like, it's such a big deal to the point where Cornelius is bowing at his feet the moment he walks into his house. And Peter's like, well, I'm glad that you guys feel this way, because I realized just recently that I should feel this way about you as well. So it's like,
got a slight confession to make here.
Yeah, it's such a strange, awkward moment here. But he goes on to explain, verse 36, he has sent this message to the people of Israel, proclaiming the gospel of peace through Jesus Christ, who is the Lord of all. You yourselves know what has happened throughout Judea, beginning in Galilee with the baptism that John proclaimed, how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit with power. Now Jesus went around doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, because God was with him. We are witnesses of all that he did, both in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem. And although they put him to death by hanging him on a tree, God raised him up on the third day and caused him to be seen, not by all the people, but by the witnesses God had chosen beforehand, by us who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. He commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one appointed by God to judge the living and the dead. All the prophets testify about him, that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. Everyone, guys. And this, to me, brings me back to Joseph, in my mind, my understanding, because we have a precedent from last week. He was trying to tell the Egyptians that he was around about the law of God, to the point where now in this week, we see his servants comforting his own brothers with, the language of the covenant. Mm-hmm. It makes me wonder if all the prophets testify about whom they believe in, the forgiveness of sins through the name, through the authority of the priesthood of Jesus of Nazareth. why he was appointed and sent by God to judge the living and the dead. Excuse me, the living and the dead. This is the same story that Enoch, all the way down, like Adam down to Enoch, down to Noah, down to Shem, down to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all the boys of Jacob, which includes Joseph. They all know the story, guys. And we're going to see that Simeon knows the story here in our companion passage here in a minute.
Yeah. The Testament of the 12 Patriarchs is just full and riddled with so much prophecy, more than a lot of, books of scripture, what we would call the Old Testament, of messianic prophecy of him coming to be a high priest and a king. And the resurrections mentioned, the kingdom to come. Beautiful stuff.
Yeah, that he was come in the flesh. Like they knew this whole story. This is why Peter would say that all the prophets knew this too. And they were witnesses of some of the fulfillment of this stuff. So this is why you would say that it's the nations that Yeshua was intended to draw in. So how could he possibly be prejudicial? The king who exemplifies the behavior of the covenant perfectly, his whole role was to come and have all the nations draw unto him. So here in Psalm 2, part of a prophecy about the Messiah, I've installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I will proclaim the decree spoken to me by the Lord. You are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask me, I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You'll break them with an iron scepter. You'll shatter them like pottery. So after he destroys the corrupt rulers of the nations, the people of those nations come to him because they're in need, just like the people in the famine came to Joseph who's in need. The people of the earth after the day of the Lord will come to Yeshua because they're in need, and he will teach them the ways of Yahweh. So Joseph is an incredible parallel example of the behavior and the fulfillment of the gospel of the kingdom through Yahweh, through the Son of God, sent by Yahweh to gather the nations for the sake of providing for them where their despotic leaders have taken from them, and then also teaching them right behavior so they can sustain themselves in covenant and get to eternal life later. So this is just super encouraging to me, because that's the behavior and the mentality that we see Joseph already exemplifying way back then. But he lived amongst people that did not share that, right? Because they were doing the ways of Babylon. They were doing the ways of the nations that rejected the covenant behavior of God, that creates division and separation as opposed to unity. So this is why, again, we don't have to read all this, but this is the kind of the crux of the example of this non-prejudicial behavior, that Yeshua, when he comes in verse 31, in his glory and all the angels are with him, he sits on his glorious throne and all the nations are gathered before him. He starts talking to them and separating them as sheep and goats. Well, the sheep, look at their behavior that they do that qualifies them as sheep to be spared in this moment. Verse 35, for I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you visited me.
Loving compassion.
Yep.
It's so amazing, guys. This is the heart of the Father. This is the Father and the Son's behavior is right here. This is what Jesus wants. This is what he does. This is what he wants to see from us as we treat, quote unquote, strangers, foreigners, people that are maybe not of our immediate family or not even of our immediate town, right? To be welcoming and hospitable. How interesting is it that Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed? Their sins piled up to heaven. Their cries went up to heaven. And what is the biggest thing that we see when the angels show up? That they're treating strangers who come into the city with the utmost disrespect, violence, murder, rape, and death. It's the opposite behavior of what Yeshua will do for the nations.
That's right. And it's cool too, because part of our inheritance, part of the promise of the resurrection is that we too inherit the nations, right? And we rule over them alongside Yeshua. And so what benefit would it be to us to be prejudicial towards, outsiders in that way?
That's right.
As Sean says often, we get to practice now what we will be doing perfectly in the kingdom.
That's right, guys. Yeah, it's such a beautiful thing. It's like, it's only because it's beautiful for different reasons to different people, but to me, it's just so simple. It's not complicated. You don't have to have that little thing they do at Catholic churches where they like shake incense all over the aisles, that they walk up and down speaking Latin and dress up in this nonsense with your little Dagon fish hat. Like, guys, it's just simply loving people. It's just, you know what? You don't know who he is. All right, well, go find out. Like, let's just love some people. That's really, it's so simple. This is the heart of the Father and the Son. This is what he wants of us. This is what we'll do forever in eternity for the people that we encounter, especially for the first 1,000 years. It's just not that hard. But all right, without further rambling, guys, thank you for entertaining this theological rabbit trail. Straight to the face. hopefully, guys. It's funny that you start talking about the behavior. You start using the general premise terms of the law of God. People get super excited. You start defining it as, oh, you gotta treat that person you don't know with love, favor, and compassion, and then they start getting kind of squirrely on you, and you're like, really? I thought we were all excited about the law of God here. Are we excited or not? Right? Oh, that means we got to go love people that don't know as much about the Bible as we do.
We see it all the time in facets of, social media and in discussion, right? People are all about the feast days versus the, pagan holidays, the dietary laws. But then when it comes to actually interacting and engaging with love and in walking and patience and all that, it's hard for them, right?
Well, I can just speak for myself. When I came to understand Torah, I definitely became a bit of a Torah terrorist, as we've talked about in the past. And I don't think it was anything other than just being excited for this new understanding and wanting to work on myself, right? Because I can control the things that I do. Like, oh, I can do this. All right, cool. I'll follow the Sabbath. Oh, cool. I won't eat this food. And then I don't know. I mean, it definitely takes some maturity to go, oh, wait a minute. The post that you shared on Facebook with the two people saying, well, he's not a real Christian because he doesn't follow the law. Well, he's not a real Christian because he thinks he can earn his salvation. That was such a perfect post to show, guys. It's
meanwhile, the persecutors only care that they're a believer, right?
Exactly. So, yeah.
Okay, just for the audience sake, I guess I'll
put it up. There you go.
I'm sorry,
so people can see what we're talking about. This is what he's talking about, guys. This is just a meme I made the other day, and just from time to time I have to prove to my wife that I can make memes. So because this is how we were attracted to each other in the very beginning, to our meme abilities. So this is basically just trying to say that there's an internal argument amongst believers, right? Because there's been this growing, extremely fervent group of people that have been coming out of mainstream churches, realizing that the fullness of God's instructions apply to them. And meanwhile, people in the mainstream churches think that they've gone back to the law, right? Because they have this really horrible understanding of what the law of God is. They think it's just Judaism. They don't realize that it is discipleship. And those people who realize it is discipleship, many of them start looking back at people still in the mainstream church who haven't come to this same understanding yet. And they start criticizing them for not being a believer because they haven't had the same realization yet. So unfortunately, the people that want to kill you in this earth, the people of Babylon, they don't care what you think. They just know that both of you think that Jesus is Lord, and they want to kill you because of that. So hopefully we just have to remember that we need to love each other, and your family of God, your fellow saints and brethren. First and foremost, we got to love them the most. But then secondly, like we've been talking about here, we just need to show the stranger and the foreigner the same love of God that we show to the family of God. So
100%. Did you see Lindsay's comment?
No, I guess not.
She never doubted.
Oh, she never doubted my meme Lord status. Yeah. Well, when we first met, I was like, before I actually started making videos, I was making a ton of memes trying to communicate the truth of the scriptures, right? And then that meme production slacked off because now I make videos all the time. So from time to time, I just got to remind her how I attracted her. So